The night air over northern France carried a damp chill that settled into every open field, every hedgerow, every concrete bunker along the Atlantic Wall. In the small hours of June 6, 1944, German sentries peered upward into a sky they had been told belonged to them. For years, Hermann Göring had proclaimed that the Luftwaffe would be the iron shield of the Reich, a force so dominant that no enemy fleet would ever cross the channel under its watch. Those words had echoed through radio broadcasts, magazines, and speeches, becoming a kind of national reassurance. The German people believed the skies were theirs. Many soldiers believed it too. Yet on this night, the promised shield was nowhere to be seen. At the Luftwaffe command bunker near Margreval, far from the front but close enough to feel the tremors of the approaching storm, officers moved in hurried footsteps across stone floors. The facility had been built for moments like this, when the weight of a continent might hinge on the ability of Germany's air arm to respond quickly and decisively. Light bulbs flickered as generators struggled with fluctuating loads, giving the corridors a pale, intermittent glow. Technicians hunched over radio sets, spinning dials, calling out for squadrons that should have been ready. Instead, they heard static, broken signals, and the occasional exhausted voice reporting mechanical failures or bad weather grounding entire units. Göring was not there yet. He had spent the previous day at one of his lavish residences, entertaining visiting officials, smoking excessively, and assuring everyone in the room that any Allied attempt to invade would be a suicide mission. He spoke with confidence, reminding them of 1940, when his fighters swept through the skies over France. With a speed and precision that startled even their own side. He reminded them of Crete, where German airborne troops had rewritten the logic of surprise attacks. He insisted the Allies feared the Luftwaffe as long as he remained in command. His voice carried the surety of a man who could not imagine his empire shrinking, but the truth had been creeping over Germany for months. Allied bombers hammered factories, fuel depots, airfields, and rail networks with a frequency that made response almost impossible. Veteran pilots were dead or exhausted. Replacements were boys with barely a few hours of training. Aviation gasoline had become a rationed commodity, guarded more fiercely than ammunition. The mighty Luftwaffe had become a patchwork of scattered, undersupplied squadrons, struggling just to take off, let alone dominate the sky. At around 1 a.m., the first signs of the Allied plan appeared as faint, distant sounds. They were so high and so far away that many Germans mistook them for thunder. The rumbling intensified until the sky vibrated like a drum. A young lieutenant at an observation post north of Caen stepped outside with a field telephone pressed to his ear. He stared upward, unable to see anything through the thin layer of clouds, but he could feel the sky trembling. His commanding officer asked for a report. The lieutenant hesitated before answering that something massive was approaching, something far larger than the small nightly raids they had grown used to. Inside the bunkers, teleprinters rattled to life, spitting out intercepted Allied transmissions and scrambled status reports from German units. A dispatcher shouted that airborne landings had been sighted near the Orne River. Another officer reported paratroopers descending near Sainte-Mère-Église. A wave of disbelief washed through the room. This could not happen without the Luftwaffe tearing them from the sky. This could not happen without a German counterattack launched within minutes. Yet the phones rang without answers from the air bases. Aircraft that should have been ready to scramble sat cold in their hangars, their fuel tanks nearly empty, or their engines undergoing repairs that were weeks behind schedule. When Göring finally arrived at the command center, a cloud of expensive cologne entered with him. His uniform glittered with medals and gold-trimmed stitching, the attire of a man who still believed in his own myth. Officers snapped to attention even as chaos unfolded around them. Göring walked with a deliberate calm, trying to project control. He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and asked for a situation report. The air operations chief stepped forward, his voice tight. Allied aircraft had been spotted in overwhelming numbers across the channel. Radar stations were reporting formations too large to count. Paratroopers were landing behind German lines. Bombers were hitting coastal defenses in what appeared to be coordinated waves. The Luftwaffe response was minimal. Only a handful of night fighters had managed to get airborne. Göring blinked slowly. His jaw clenched, then relaxed. He asked about JG-26, the fighter wing that had been one of his pride units. The answer came quickly. They were grounded due to lack of fuel. He asked about the bomber groups stationed in the interior. They had already sustained heavy losses in earlier raids and were scattered or unprepared. His confidence wavered for the first time. Outside, the dawn was beginning to stain the sky with a muted gray. As the light spread across Normandy, it revealed the true scale of what was happening. Allied aircraft swarmed overhead in vast formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. Thousands of planes moved with mechanical precision, dropping bombs on gun emplacements, roads, and communication centers. German flak crews fired desperately, but their shells burst uselessly among the clouds. A communications officer rushed into the room, nearly colliding with Göring as he threw a decoded message onto the table. It reported that Allied naval vessels were filling the channel in numbers no German reconnaissance aircraft had been able to verify. The invasion was coming in full force, shielded not by stealth, but by air power so overwhelming that any German movement on the ground was instantly targeted. For years, Göring had built his reputation on the promise that the Luftwaffe would control the skies of Europe. Now he stood in a bunker, listening to reports of Allied dominance that dwarfed anything he had imagined. He slammed his fist onto the table, demanding that every available fighter be scrambled immediately. Officers exchanged glances. They knew there were hardly any left to send. Göring's orders echoed through the bunker, but the reality outside did not bend to his will. As the morning advanced, a heavy silence settled inside the command center. Not a silence of calm, but one of realization. The promised shield had cracked long before this night. Now it had shattered completely. The sky that Göring had sworn would protect Germany had slipped from his control. And as the first Allied soldiers began stepping onto the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe's absence became the defining truth of the day. The invasion had begun, and the Reich stood exposed. Hermann Göring had not always been a figure of ridicule among his own officers. In the early years of the Third Reich, he moved through Berlin like a knight from legend, wrapped in lavish uniforms and overflowing confidence. His booming laughter filled marble corridors. His promises of air supremacy impressed even hardened generals who doubted Hitler's political instincts. Göring presented himself as the architect of a new kind of war, one defined by speed, precision, and total control of the sky. He claimed the Luftwaffe would be the sword and shield of Germany, a force so modern and powerful that no enemy could challenge it. To many watching his rise, these promises seemed achievable. Germany was rearming at a pace unseen in Europe for decades, and Göring stood at the center of that whirlwind. Yet behind the parade grounds and theatrical speeches, cracks were already visible. By 1941, when German armies surged deep into the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe had begun to stretch far beyond its intended limits. Aircraft designed for short-range tactical strikes were suddenly expected to support operations across thousands of kilometers. Maintenance units struggled to keep aircraft operational in mud, extreme cold, and improvised airfields. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them, especially on the Eastern Front, where Soviet resistance grew fiercer every month. Göring pretended not to notice. He continued to boast of invincible air power even as reports piled up on his desk detailing shortages, mechanical failures, and mounting casualties. In meetings with Hitler, Göring presented a picture of strength that masked the internal decay. He was eager to maintain his influence, and so he painted every setback as temporary. When Allied bombers began striking German cities with increasing frequency, Göring promised that his fighters would soon tear them from the sky. When fuel supplies began tightening, he dismissed the warnings as exaggerated. He reassured the Führer that Germany's enemies were weak, disorganized, and incapable of mounting any significant offensive through the air. Hitler, who valued loyalty as much as competence, rewarded Göring's confidence and ignored the voices urging more realistic assessments. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, frustration simmered. Senior officers whispered among themselves that Göring no longer understood the machine he commanded. Many of them had served under him since the early days, when his energy and charisma had inspired a sense of unity, but by 1943 he had become distant, distracted by his private estates, his extravagant lifestyle, and his constant hunger for personal admiration. Field commanders struggled to secure resources, spare parts, and fuel. Requests for reinforcements were delayed or ignored. Pilots fought in the air with outdated aircraft or poorly trained replacements who died in their first weeks of combat. The collapse accelerated in 1943 when Allied bombing raids doubled in intensity. The sky above Germany became a battleground every day, and the Luftwaffe could not keep pace. Long-range American escorts like the P-51 Mustang now accompanied bombers deep into the Reich. German fighters that once dominated the skies found themselves overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactics. Factories producing critical aircraft components were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. The Luftwaffe, once Göring's proudest creation, was slowly suffocating under the pressure. By early 1944, the truth was undeniable to everyone except Göring himself. Intelligence reports showed that the Allies were assembling the largest invasion force in history across the English Channel. Reconnaissance photographs revealed endless rows of ships, vehicles, and aircraft. The scale of the preparation was staggering. German strategists sounded alarms, warning that the invasion could come at any moment. They insisted that the Luftwaffe must rebuild its defensive capacity or risk catastrophic failure. Göring responded with the same familiar confidence. He claimed the Allies would never dare attempt a landing, while the Luftwaffe remained active. He argued that even if they tried, German aircraft would strike swiftly and decisively, crushing the invasion before it reached shore. He made these promises publicly as well. In a speech broadcast across the Reich, Göring declared that no enemy soldier would land on the shores of Europe under his watch. He described the Luftwaffe as a wall of steel and fire, controlled by the most experienced pilots in the world. His words were greeted with applause, but many listeners felt a private unease. The air raids over Berlin had become a nightly torment. Families slept in shelters, praying the bombs would fall elsewhere. People had begun to ask why the Luftwaffe seemed unable to intercept the attackers. Göring dismissed such questions as defeatist, blaming bad weather or temporary shortages. Still, doubt was spreading. Among those who saw the reality most clearly were the ground crews and mechanics who worked on the Luftwaffe's aircraft every day. They stood on cold tarmac in worn-out boots, trying to service fighters with parts scavenged from wrecked planes. They watched young recruits climb into cockpits with barely 10 hours of flight time. They listened to radios crackle with calls for backup that never came. Many of them speculated that Göring no longer cared about the war's outcome. He lived in a world of hunting lodges, luxury meals, and tailored uniforms. The men who fought under his command lived in constant fear and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Allied air forces sharpened their own strategy. Their goal was not only to bomb cities, but to cripple the Luftwaffe entirely. They targeted aircraft factories, rail lines, fuel depots, and every major airbase within range. The more they struck, the harder it became for the Luftwaffe to function. Entire squadrons were grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Others waited weeks for spare engines or replacement propellers. The once feared German air machine was now a shadow of itself, held together by desperation. In the weeks before D-Day, this weakness became critical. German commanders along the Channel front pleaded for reconnaissance flights to give them updated information on Allied movements. They received almost nothing. Aircraft that should have been patrolling the coast sat idle. Weather delays, mechanical issues, and fuel shortages combined to leave the Germans almost blind at the very moment they needed clarity. The invasion, when it came, would strike an enemy whose air force had already been hollowed out beyond repair. Göring continued to make promises even as the ground beneath his command shifted. He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe would rise to meet any threat. He insisted that the Allies were bluffing, that their air superiority was temporary, that one decisive counterattack would restore control. His officers listened in silence, knowing the truth, but unable to challenge him openly. To oppose Göring was to risk one's career, or worse. So they nodded, took notes, and returned to their desks, carrying orders they knew could not be executed. By June 1944, the stage was set for the final test of Göring's promises. The Luftwaffe stood weakened, exhausted, and fragmented, while the greatest invasion force in history waited across the Channel. Göring believed his reputation, his legacy, and his pride would be vindicated by a swift German response. He believed the sky still belonged to him. What he did not understand was that the sky had already slipped from his grasp long before the first Allied soldiers set foot on Normandy's beaches. The hour of reckoning was approaching, and the Luftwaffe was not ready. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the Normandy coast lay under a blanket of heavy gray clouds. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and a faint wind rustled through wheat fields that had stood untouched through years of occupation. German sentries at their posts shifted uneasily, rubbing their arms against the cold as they stared toward the Channel. They had been warned of an invasion for months, but nothing in their training could prepare them for the sight that was about to unfold. The first hints came not from the sea, but from the sky. Shortly after 3:30 a.m., a distant roar began to ripple through the air. It started as a low vibration, like the earth itself was stirring awake. But it grew with a steady, rhythmic pulse until the very atmosphere trembled. A sergeant stationed near Pointe du Hoc stepped outside his bunker and looked up. At first he saw nothing but darkness, but then his eyes caught faint glimmers of movement, shadows flitting across the clouds. He lifted his field glasses. What he saw made him stumble back. The sky was filled with aircraft. Allied transport planes, thousands of them, moved in precise formation. Their engines churned in synchronized thunder, forming a sound so immense it seemed to swallow every other noise. From their open doors, paratroopers leapt into the void, their silhouettes drifting through beams of moonlight before disappearing into the landscape below. The Germans scrambled to respond, but the coastal batteries were still tracking the sea. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to be the first line of defense, was nowhere to be found. Inside the German 84th Corps headquarters at St. Lo, officers rushed between tables cluttered with maps and radios. The first reports had come in fragments. Paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église, explosions around Carentan, multiple landings across the Cotentin Peninsula. A staff officer tried to reach nearby airfields for reconnaissance updates, but the lines were jammed or silent. He shouted for any available Luftwaffe support. The answer he received was a grim shake of the head. Aircraft were grounded, scattered, or simply too few to deploy. As the sky lightened with the first touches of dawn, the scale of the Allied air presence became undeniable. The horizon glowed with the steady blink of navigation lights, creating an eerie constellation stretching from east to west. A German anti-aircraft unit near Omaha Beach opened fire, but their shells burst harmlessly among the clouds as wave after wave of Allied planes roared overhead. The Germans fired blindly, knowing they stood little chance of hitting anything. Their gunners worked with mechanical desperation, but for every aircraft damaged, another 100 took its place. At 5 a.m., the first Allied fighter squadrons swept into the region. They dove low over the beaches and roadways, strafing supply convoys, communication posts, and any movement that looked remotely organized. Villagers across Normandy awoke to the sight of P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires slicing across the sky with confident precision. Their engines screamed as they climbed and rolled, occasionally releasing rockets that tore through bunkers and artillery positions. German soldiers who tried to retreat or reposition found themselves trapped under constant assault. They crouched in ditches, covering their heads as bullets kicked up dirt around them. In Berlin, far from the chaos, Hermann Göring was already awake. He had received fragmented reports during the night, but now his aides brought him the full picture. Allied airborne landings, heavy bombing, no significant Luftwaffe response. He paced across the floor of his command room, his expression tightening with each new update. He ordered immediate deployment of every available fighter wing, insisting that the skies must be cleared at once. His officers stood rigidly, giving crisp nods, even though they knew most of the units he was calling for had no fuel or were too damaged to fly. Back in Normandy, German infantry along the coast braced for the naval barrage. The sea, once a dark and quiet line at the edge of their vision, now shimmered with the silhouettes of thousands of ships. A few soldiers gasped in disbelief. Others cursed under their breath. Allied vessels stretched as far as the eye could see, their formation so massive that it looked like an iron wall had risen from the water. But above all of it, the sky remained the greatest shock. It was not the muted gray of early morning anymore. It carried movement, life, and power in every direction. At 6:30 a.m., when the first landing craft began scraping toward the shores of Utah and Omaha, Allied bombers thundered overhead in support. Medium and heavy bombers rained explosives onto German strongpoints, though many bombs fell wide due to poor visibility. Even so, the Germans felt the ground tremble repeatedly as the coastline erupted in fire and smoke. The Luftwaffe remained absent from the scene. Only a handful of German aircraft took to the air that morning, and many of them failed to reach the beaches due to overwhelming Allied fighter patrols. One German pilot who did manage to take off, Oberleutnant Friedrich Fürst, flew alone toward the invasion zone in a Focke-Wulf 190. He expected to see targets everywhere. Instead, he found the sky already sealed by Allied fighters. A squadron of P-51 Mustangs intercepted him within minutes. He dove into a cloud bank, hoping to escape, but they pursued relentlessly. His aircraft took damage in the right wing. He barely made it back to base. When he climbed down from his cockpit, he whispered to a mechanic that they were facing an enemy with limitless planes. The mechanic nodded silently. He had already known. On the beaches, chaos intensified. German defenders fired machine guns and mortars, trying to hold the line, but Allied aircraft dove overhead in constant arcs. Pilots selected targets with practiced ease, striking gun emplacements and ammunition bunkers. A unit of German artillery near Vierville attempted to reposition to a better angle on the landing craft. But a pair of P-47s caught them in open ground. The lead plane's rockets consumed the battery in a flash of fire. Survivors sprinted for cover, shouting warnings that the skies were no longer theirs. Throughout the morning, the imbalance grew more pronounced. Allied aircraft operated with complete freedom. They flew low-level sweeps over highways, cutting German reinforcements off from the coast. They circled above the beaches, providing live communication support to naval and ground forces. They hit any German vehicle trying to move south or west. The Luftwaffe did not appear to challenge them. German soldiers joked bitterly among themselves that they no longer needed helmets. They needed roofs. By midday, the truth was clear to every German who could still fight. The air war over Normandy had already been decided. It had not been a battle. It had been a takeover. The sky had shifted color, not literally, but symbolically, turning from the gray of German authority to the deep, confident blue of Allied dominance. The Reich had lost the one element Göring had sworn they controlled without question. And as German commanders desperately tried to form a coherent response, the realization spread through every bunker, trench, and command post. The invasion force had stepped onto the shores of France because the sky above them had become a fortress of Allied steel. In that blinding morning light, the Luftwaffe's collapse was not just visible, it was undeniable. The bunker at Margreval had been built to withstand artillery strikes, aerial bombardment, and even the collapse of the Reich itself. What it could not contain was the sound of failure. On the afternoon of June 6, 1944, Hermann Göring stood inside that cold, concrete chamber as the truth he had spent years denying finally turned against him. The thick walls amplified every vibration from the teleprinters, every frantic message shouted across the room, every muffled explosion from hundreds of kilometers away where Germany's soldiers fought under a sky they no longer controlled. Göring moved stiffly, as if burdened by an invisible weight. His uniform, once a symbol of bombast and authority, hung awkwardly on his frame. The gold braid that decorated his sleeves glinted under the dim lighting. But the man inside the uniform seemed diminished. His officers avoided his eyes. They stood by their desks, shuffling papers, whispering urgently, or staring at maps covered in red arrows, pushing inexorably inland from the Normandy beaches. Every report brought the same grim news. Allied warships were pounding the coastline. Paratroopers had secured key bridges. Infantry divisions were establishing beachheads that were expanding by the hour. Most devastating of all, Allied air dominance was absolute. A major at the communications desk reported that the Luftwaffe had managed fewer than 200 sorties across the entire front. The Allies had flown more than 12,000. Göring's jaw tightened. He demanded fuel figures, pilot availability, and aircraft readiness. The answers came in broken lines of apology and technical explanations that masked the simple truth. They had nothing to send. The Luftwaffe had been ground down long before this day, and now the moment that should have vindicated him had exposed everything he had hidden. A general who had once sworn that no enemy would cross the channel under German skies now watched those same skies filled entirely with Allied planes. An adjutant approached, holding the latest reconnaissance assessment. Göring snatched it without a word. His eyes scanned the page. The Allies had achieved air supremacy. Their fighters controlled every road, every field, every bridge. German reinforcements were being attacked before they even left their barracks. Columns of tanks were forced to halt under trees, terrified of being spotted from above. Supply trucks burst into flames before reaching the front. The Reich, for the first time in the war, was fighting on ground it no longer owned. He tossed the report onto a table and stared at a large wall map where tiny colored markers indicated the positions of airfields. Many had been bombed out of service. Others had no fuel. A handful still operated, but their runways were clogged with damaged aircraft. Göring felt something inside him twist, a sensation he could not name. It was not quite fear. It was something deeper, something he had spent years forcing down. The slow, agonizing realization that the Luftwaffe he had promised to build had crumbled long before the invasion arrived. An officer stepped forward cautiously, clearing his throat. He explained that Allied bombers were now targeting German command centers, rail hubs, and communication lines. They were flying low, unchallenged, selecting targets at will. Göring waved him away, unwilling to hear more. His eyes darted toward the ceiling, as if expecting to hear engines overhead. He remembered the early days of the war when German planes had owned the skies. When Stukas dove with terrifying precision. When French columns shattered under Luftwaffe attacks. When London burned in the Blitz. He remembered the pride, the confidence, the belief that he had created an air force unmatched in human history. All of it felt distant now, like a story someone else had lived. At a small desk near the far end of the bunker, a junior officer listened to intercepted Allied radio traffic. He looked pale as he relayed the details. Fighter groups were sweeping the entire region. Bomber squadrons were calling out targets. Ground controllers were coordinating strikes with infantry on the beaches. Every channel crackled with energy and momentum. The Allies were not improvising. They were executing a plan crafted with precision, supported by an air force at the peak of its power. Göring's promise of an impenetrable sky lay in ruins. The officers around him could feel it. The bunker itself seemed to feel it. A colonel approached carefully, carrying a wooden clipboard. He reported that several Luftwaffe fighter groups had refused to take off due to fuel shortages. Another group had lost half its remaining aircraft to mechanical failures. Göring's face darkened. He snapped that excuses would not win battles. The colonel stood silently, knowing there was nothing left to argue. The Luftwaffe had not failed because of excuses. It had failed because it had been bled dry over years of impossible demands and catastrophic mismanagement. Late in the afternoon, a courier burst into the room with a telegram from Normandy. German soldiers were begging for air support. They described skies filled with Allied fighters that strafed anything that moved. They pleaded for interventions that Göring could not provide. He read the message twice, then lowered the paper slowly. His hand trembled. Officers watched him, searching his face for some sign of the confidence he had radiated for so long. There was none. After several hours of pacing, Göring finally sank into a chair near the back of the bunker. The room continued to buzz with frantic activity, but he seemed removed from it, lost in thoughts that no one dared interrupt. He lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. Smoke curled in front of his eyes, creating a haze that softened the harshness of the map beside him. In its shifting patterns, he seemed to see something far more threatening than the Allied invasion. He saw the collapse of the myth he had spent his life constructing. The Luftwaffe had once been the pride of the Reich. It had once been his pride. Now the skies over Normandy belonged entirely to the enemy. There was no denying the truth any longer. Not to Hitler, not to his officers, not even to himself. As night approached, reports grew worse. The beachheads had grown stronger. The Allies were pouring in armor, artillery, and supplies under a shield Göring could do nothing to pierce. The failure of this day would echo throughout the Reich, undermining everything he had ever claimed. His legacy had shattered in a single morning. In the bunker's stale air, surrounded by the noise of defeat, Hermann Göring finally faced the moment he had spent years avoiding. He had promised Germany that no invasion would succeed under his watch. Now he watched the greatest invasion in history unfold without a single meaningful response from the air force he once controlled. The myth died there, quietly, under concrete and flickering lights. And outside, across France, the skies remained Allied blue. In the end, the collapse of the Luftwaffe was not decided by a single battle, but by years of industrial exhaustion and reckless leadership. Göring had promised the German people a sky guarded by unmatched power, yet D-Day revealed the truth with brutal clarity. The Allies did not win the air war through boasts or ideology, but through the relentless, coordinated strength of free nations working toward a common purpose. On June 6, 1944, the world saw that unity made their air fleets unstoppable. Germany's soldiers fought bravely on the ground, but their fate had already been sealed in the sky above them. And as the Reich crumbled, the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility crumbled with it, marking the beginning of an end that would reshape Europe and the world.